Muy buenos días. Vamos a iniciar con el segundo panel de esta conferencia, que es el relativo al estado de las políticas sobre la droga y el tráfico de drogas en los Estados Unidos y México. Participan en esta mesa el profesor Alejandro Robledo de la Universidad Panamericana de la Ciudad de México, Michelle Crawford del Departamento de Justicia de Estados Unidos, de la Procuraduría, particularmente del programa Iniciativa Mérida, y el doctor Matthew Robinson de la Universidad Estatal de los Appalachian. Igualmente participa el doctor Howard Campbell de la Universidad de Texas, El Paso. Vamos a iniciar con la participación de nuestro representante de la Universidad Panamericana, el doctor Alejandro Robledo. Él es licenciado en Derecho por la Universidad Panamericana con estudios de maestría en la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Fue jefe de asesores en la Procuraduría de Justicia del Distrito Federal, director general de consignaciones de esa misma institución, fiscal de procesos penales en el Reclusorio Sur y coordinador general de agentes del Ministerio Público, auxiliares del Procurador. Actualmente se desempeña como abogado litigante y también como docente en diversas instituciones de educación superior. Su tema es cómo operan las bandas de delincuencia organizada en el Distrito Federal. Maestro, tiene la palabra.
Gracias, muy amable. Buenos días a todos. Quiero empezar por agradecer a la Universidad de Emory la invitación, obviamente a mi propia universidad, a la Universidad Panamericana y al instituto del que formo parte, para estar aquí con ustedes este día. A modo de introducción les diría, si ven polvo es porque estamos limpiando la casa, aseguró Felipe Calderón, el presidente de México, al periódico Le Monde en agosto. En mi opinión parece más un huracán que un poco de polvo en la casa, ¿no? Y en las cifras así lo demuestran. Van más de 28,000 homicidios relacionados con la delincuencia organizada, 22,000 de ellos en el sexenio de Felipe Calderón. Estoy consciente del esfuerzo que está haciendo el gobierno federal, sin embargo no comparto la forma y la estrategia en que lo están desarrollando y más adelante les diré por qué. Aparece un fenómeno muy extraño con la delincuencia organizada. La ruptura de los cárteles o la detención o el asesinato de alguno de los grandes capos parecería que deben disminuir en una lógica o en una sana lógica su capacidad de operación y la espiral de la violencia. Esto no sucede así. Cada vez que uno de los grandes capos es detenido o asesinado por alguna de las bandas contrarias, la espiral de la violencia crece y nunca regresa a su nivel original. Y esto obedece a una razón muy simple. Las bandas empiezan a construir un ejército cada vez mayor, preparándose para lo que viene, ya sea la embestida del gobierno o bien la guerra que van a tener junto con sus contrarios, sus contrapartes, ¿no? Y el nivel de la violencia nunca baja. De hecho, ha ido siempre en ascenso, ¿no? Alejandro Barata, el criminólogo crítico, creo que es importante tocar este tema, ¿no? Decía, antes de hablar de educación y de reinserción, es pues menester hacer un examen del sistema de valores y de los modelos del comportamiento presentes en la sociedad en la que se quiere reinsertar al detenido. Tal examen no puede sino llevar a la conclusión de que la verdadera reeducación debería comenzar por la sociedad antes que por el condenado. Ante la ausencia de una política criminal clara en México que esté vinculada a otras muchas cosas, es muy complicado combatir la delincuencia. Ayer lo decía el señor ministro, este no es un tema que podamos atacar solos y creo que no es un tema que podamos atacar desde un solo ángulo, ¿no? El derecho penal nunca será suficiente y el derecho penal no está construido nada más para eso. Pasando al tema que nos ocupa, yo diría que hay 7 grandes cárteles en México. El cártel de Tijuana, el cártel del Golfo, que están los Zetas, el cártel de Juárez, el cártel de Sinaloa del Chapo Guzmán, el cártel de Colima, el cártel del Istmo de los hermanos Díaz Parada y el cártel del Milenio. De estos 7, 4 de ellos, los primeros 4, son los que en su conjunto ocupan, controlan y se disputan la mayor parte del territorio nacional, ¿no? Hay 3 momentos importantes en la historia del narcotráfico y ha ido cambiando la historia del narcotráfico en México. Como ayer decía alguno de los expositores, originalmente México fue un país de tránsito de la droga y a los grupos se les pagaba por custodiar y trasladar la droga, se les pagaba en efectivo, ¿no? En algún punto eso ya no sucedió, les pagaban con droga y tuvieron que crear un mercado para poder cobrar sus honorarios, ¿no? Hay un punto muy importante, en una reunión que hubo en Acapulco en 1989, México tiene uno de los grandes capos que muy poca gente habla, o sí, obviamente se conoce, pero no se habla tanto de él, ¿no? Que es Juan José Esparragosa, alias el Azul. El Azul sostiene esta reunión en Acapulco en el 89 como consecuencia de la captura de Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, y esto obliga una recomposición de las estructuras delictivas para ponerse de acuerdo. Evidentemente, como en toda recomposición, hay muchas de las partes que no quedan conformes, que no están contentos como fue estructurado, y empieza la guerra. Esta guerra que hoy se vive es consecuencia un poco o mucho de esa reunión fallida o de esa estructura que no se pudo lograr porque no se pudieron lograr los acuerdos deseados, porque evidentemente son gente ambiciosa que siempre quiere más, ¿no? El poder político y los recursos jurídicos que utiliza, ¿no? ¿Cómo funcionaba a grandes rasgos y en una estructura más o menos completa los grupos delincuenciales? Por lo menos en los 80s y a finales de los 90s, ¿no? Un grupo llegaba a una plaza, que se le dice, llámese Guerrero, a un estado, en fin, a una zona, Tampico, y lo primero que hacía, llegaba un primer grupo que controlaba la información, que obtenía la información, que veía de manera operativa con quién debían de tratar, quién era el jefe de la policía, quiénes eran las personas a las que tenían que corromper para poder trabajar. Después un segundo grupo llegaba a implementar esa parte de la información, esa parte de la operación, corrompía, estructuraba, señalaba las rutas, las formas de operación, y un último grupo llegaba a establecerse en la plaza y a controlarlo, ¿no? Y así sucedió en términos generales durante mucho tiempo. Han ido cambiando sus estructuras, han ido cambiando sus formas, han aprovechado ya al derecho también, han aprovechado a ciertas instituciones que su fin es eminentemente bueno, proteger los derechos humanos, utilizan a sus propias familias para hacer manifestaciones, infiltrarse, ¿no? Y a propósito de esto, el escritor y periodista Jorge Fernández Menéndez, que es pues una gente que sabe bastante de este tema, en mi concepto, dice: en los hechos parecería que estamos tratando con presos políticos, con detenidos que están en prisión por sus ideas y no por ser, como son, elementos del crimen organizado considerados de alta peligrosidad para la sociedad, ¿no? Hemos llegado al absurdo que recientemente un diputado federal que cuenta con orden de aprehensión por delitos graves, por delincuencia organizada, por delitos contra la salud, acaba de rendir protesta en la Cámara de Diputados y, como consecuencia de su protesta, tiene fuero constitucional y no puede ser detenido. El fuero constitucional fue planeado en su origen como una forma de proteger a los legisladores sobre sus expresiones, ¿no? Para que pudieran expresarse libremente y no fueran perseguidos por sus ideas. Ciertamente no fue concebido para que alguien que está acusado de delitos como estos lo utilice para no ser detenido, ¿no? La falta de claridad del sistema jurídico mexicano en muchas de estas partes les otorga prerrogativas, ¿no? La falta del sentido del derecho penal en México, un gran porcentaje de los detenidos en los reclusorios son por delitos menores, ¿no? Y en lugar de tener una reinserción social, estamos creando escuelas del delito y además estamos desviando, y lo veremos un poco más adelante, el estado de fuerza operacional del Estado para atacar a las grandes bandas, porque estamos más ocupados en atacar a personas que ciertamente cometieron una conducta delictiva y que tendrían que ser sancionados, pero no con esa excesiva fuerza, ¿no? Otra de las cosas que ha pasado es que las grandes bandas de delincuencia organizada originalmente se dedicaban a su negocio, que era el narcotráfico, Hoy, lamentablemente, se han expandido y han ocupado la plaza en todos sus rubros, ¿no? Se dedican al secuestro, a la extorsión, a la trata de blancas, al tráfico de personas, al robo de vehículos, en fin. Son muchas las actividades delincuenciales que tienen que desarrollar y la razón es aparentemente simple, ¿no? Tienen un ejército tan grande de gente que sostener que no es suficiente y además muchas veces entre ellos los contratan pero no les pagan. Entonces estos delincuentes pues sobreviven como pueden y evidentemente si su jefe no les está pagando por el tráfico de drogas, pues ellos se dedican a lo que mejor saben hacer, que es delinquir en cualquiera de sus rubros, ¿no? El estado de fuerza de la policía siempre es complicado, ¿no? A mí como funcionario de la Procuraduría, cuando me tocaba organizar algún operativo, pues era complicado. Primero lo que había que hacer era no avisarle a los agentes, ¿no? A tu propio estado de fuerza no le podías decir. Los agarrabas de improviso. Lo que yo hacía era, antes del operativo, les quitaba los teléfonos, los beepers, cualquier forma de comunicación. Si el operativo implicaba salir de la ciudad por alguna razón, nos teníamos que esconder en camiones de alguna empresa, de Nestlé, en fin, alguna empresa. Si teníamos que cruzar alguna caseta, pues no podíamos ser vistos porque las gentes de las casetas les avisan también que van los operativos para allá. Y no le dices a tu gente de qué se trata el operativo hasta el último de los momentos. Porque si tú les dices, evidentemente los delincuentes se van a enterar. Y cuando llegues no vas a encontrar lo que estás buscando, ¿no? Matamoros, que es un estado, la ciudad de Matamoros, que ha sufrido muchísimo como consecuencia de esta guerra. Recientemente me tocó ir a ver algún asunto. Fui revisado varias veces en los retenes militares, ¿no? Hay helicópteros sobrevolando la zona, pero los delincuentes duermen enterrados durante la mañana y gran parte de la tarde para no ser detectados por los helicópteros y salen hasta después en la noche para poder operar, ¿no? Esta es una de las formas en las que están operando. Hay un grupo criminal particularmente violento que se está desarrollando, que son los Zetas, ¿no? Los Zetas no son delincuentes comunes, no fueron formados como delincuentes comunes, son parte de un grupo especial del ejército que se llamaban GAFES, ¿no? Están bajo el mando de Osiel Cárdenas y este grupo de aeromóviles de fuerzas especiales del ejército mexicano fue reclutado hace ya varios años y ha desarrollado una identidad propia y una violencia prácticamente incontrolable. Son capaces, por el mismo entrenamiento que tienen, ¿no?, de desarrollar operaciones de logística, de armamento, de tecnología. Han sido o fueron entrenados por gobiernos extranjeros, inclusive por Estados Unidos o por Israel, ¿no? Y sus principales actividades, evidentemente, es la protección y la extorsión, la ejecución de personas, enemigos políticos o enemigos de otras bandas, la custodia y el traslado de la droga y las operaciones de seguridad de sus miembros, ¿no? Por eso ellos tienen códigos de comunicación, no dicen sus nombres, por eso es el Z40, el Z1 que es el comandante, el Z5 que es un suboficial, ¿no?, el Z2 que es un subcomandante. Las estructuras delincuenciales ya no son solamente verticales, sino también son horizontales y operan en muchas ocasiones como operaría una banda, una célula o células terroristas. No se conocen entre ellos, tienen objetivos muy claros y no saben exactamente qué está haciendo la otra célula, por si es capturada o asesinada, no puedan delatarlos, ¿no? Los Zetas cuentan, y casi toda la delincuencia organizada, pues con una estructura muy complicada de información, de comunicación, ¿no? Hay los que les dicen los halcones, que son taxistas o personas normales que se dedican a avisarles cuando va un operativo, a vigilar las zonas de distribución. Son grupos de inteligencia muy primarios, pero estructurados en las calles para avisarles, ¿no? Utilizan mucho también a los menores de edad, lamentablemente, porque para empezar hay una gran pobreza en México, entonces utilizan y se aprovechan de eso, utilizan a los menores de edad que son fácil blanco a cambio de dinero o de droga para que los ayuden a operar. se trasladan en bicicleta estos muchachos y también les avisan y se dedican a avisarles, ¿no? Y luego hay un grupo de dirección dentro de los grupos delincuenciales que son expertos en comunicaciones, que interceptan llamadas, que pueden identificar muy bien los vehículos, actúan también como una especie de grupo de reacción, ¿no? Como un comando negro, llevan a cabo secuestros, asesinan a sus contrarios. Es decir, la delincuencia organizada opera de manera profesional, estructurada, aprovecha sus talentos, utiliza la maquinaria jurídica del Estado, corrompe a las autoridades, desde los más bajos hasta los más altos niveles, y aprovecha el desconcierto y los errores de planeación de los gobiernos, ¿no? Los narcotraficantes llegan al absurdo, y creo que todo el mundo lo sabemos, ¿no? Ellos no cuentan el dinero, lo pesan, porque es tanto que es muy complicado contarlo. $1 millón en billetes de 100 pesa 37 libras, $1 millón en billetes de 50 pesa 74. Para que vean la capacidad de reacción que tienen, la facilidad de corromper, ¿no? Es tanto el dinero que tienen que no pueden ni siquiera contarlo, lo tienen que pesar. Su estrategia es muy clara, está bien estructurada, ¿no? Es que las fuerzas federales no puedan tener presencia. Por eso los eventos que ocurren a nivel local es muy importante para ellos. Ellos tienen que controlar las zonas, no les interesa conectar toda la República, les interesa conectar siempre zonas, porque en la medida que el gobierno tenga menos capacidad de operación y menos estado de fuerza, tendrá que cubrir más territorio. Por eso tuvo que entrar el ejército, porque las policías estaban totalmente infiltradas. Pues también tan importante, y lo que ha insistido el secretario de Seguridad Pública Federal, de que haya un mando único, por lo menos estatal, para que puedan apoyar a las fuerzas federales, porque las fuerzas federales por sí mismas, para empezar, no estaban diseñadas para eso, y además es demasiado territorio y demasiada estructura la que tienen que cubrir, ¿no? Por eso las mantas, por eso los mensajes, por eso los asesinatos a los periodistas, porque es una forma de intimidación y una forma de distraer a la autoridad federal que se dedica a apagar focos rojos en ciertos estados de la República y los traen de un lado para otro, mientras ellos están perfectamente bien acampados y estructurados en una zona, ya sea Tampico y esto. Creo que es muy importante que México desarrolle una política criminal seria, apartidista, con visión de futuro, que no tenga nada que ver con los partidos y con los intereses. Es muy importante para poder atacar y estructurar un sistema, ¿no? Y bueno, creo que México tiene que cambiar su forma de ver las cosas, ¿no? Tenemos que pasar de un sistema muy importante que hemos tenido históricamente de caudillos y de la creación de un caudillo que es el que nos va a rescatar de todos nuestros males. Esto no va a pasar, ¿no? México tiene que estructurar sus instituciones, fortalecer sus instituciones, crear una política criminal, recomponer a sus policías, eventualmente retirar al ejército de las calles, ¿no? Porque no es su función, pero tampoco le queda de otra, y los criminales lo saben, ¿no? Los militares son la última barrera del Estado, ellos no pueden fallar. Por eso creo importante dos propuestas muy concretas, ¿no? Y alguien de los ponentes de ayer también lo mencionaba. Creo que debe haber un código penal y código de procedimientos penales únicos para toda la República, y sí creo que debe haber una policía, por lo menos estatal, única, para que no tengamos que distribuir la fuerza de operación del Ejército, de la Policía Federal, y podamos atacar el narcotráfico. Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos al licenciado Robledo que haya compartido con nosotros la perspectiva del funcionario público al abordar esta temática de la delincuencia organizada, particularmente este enfoque relacionado con las implicaciones políticas y hasta partidistas que tiene la corrupción. Y enseguida tengo el privilegio de presentarles a la licenciada Michelle Crawford, y me voy a permitir leer su currículum en inglés, pues no dispongo de una versión en español. Michelle Crawford has been an attorney with the United States Department of Justice since 1989 and has worked in the area of rule of law development around the world since October 1998. She is an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of Florida, Miami, where she litigated civil and criminal law drug forfeiture cases, and subsequently joined DOJ's asset forfeiture and money laundering section. She currently works within the Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development, Assistance and Training, where she first served as a liaison to the United States Agency for International Development, forming linkage for providing criminal justice sector assistance around the world. She was OPDAT's Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, and that capacity began OPDAT's Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, and that capacity began contact with the region that previously had had little contact with American federal prosecutors and judges. She received the Assistant Attorney General's Collaboration Award in 2005 for OPDATs as work relating to the People's Republic of China. She is currently assigned to assist in the leadership of the Mérida Initiative, a multi-year, multi-million-dollar program of assistance for rule of law in Mexico. She also serves as the liaison to the federal judiciary for all the OPDATs program in Mexico and around the world. Michelle va a compartir con nosotros su conferencia denominada La Iniciativa Mérida, cómo el Departamento de Justicia está asistiendo al sistema de justicia penal mexicano para enfrentar el desafío de los carteles de drogas. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Can I be heard all over the room? Okay, please let me know if you can't hear me. Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to say how happy I am to have been invited to participate in this conference. It's going wonderfully, and I'm learning a lot. And I want to also extend regrets on behalf of the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, who could not be here today. And luckily for me, his criminal chief could not be here today. His Assistant Attorney General couldn't be here. So that's how you got me. But I hope that I can do the Department of Justice proud in describing how we have been invited as a partner to help Mexico with some of its criminal justice sector reforms. Let me begin by just telling you a little bit about OPDAT. There are some brochures that I brought along with me, and they're available on the table to tell you a little bit about OPDAT. It's a part of the criminal division in the United States Department of Justice, and our role is to develop relationships with other countries' criminal justice systems for the greater purpose of opposing, arresting, preventing transnational organized crime. So when the President of Mexico and the United States President got together to discuss the problem of the escalating violence by drug cartels in Mexico, and ultimately our Mexican Attorney General and Attorney General Eric Holder sat down and tried to discuss what we could jointly do about this, it ultimately came to the Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development, Assistance and Training within the department's criminal division to come up with a plan of action that would help to stem this rising violence on the part of the drug cartels. And Mr. Robledo very passionately explained some of the heartbreaking violence that has been occurring that has not only affected Mexicans but has affected Americans as well. One of our closest analogies is when the United States was trying to combat the drug cartel activity that was spilling into South Florida from Colombia about 10 years ago. And at that time, I was also practicing law as an assistant United States attorney in Miami, Florida, and had an opportunity to lead prosecutions and and task force investigations relating to drug trafficking and money laundering from some of those Colombian cartels. So although we know that the violence that we're seeing now is not the same, the circumstances are not the same, the people involved are not the same, there are some analogies that we can draw on, and there's some experiences that we have grown from that we can share with our Mexican prosecutor and law enforcement counterparts. And so at OPDAT, we sat down and discussed what were the best ways for us to be able to help. Now, the Department of Justice receives an appropriation from Congress to do its work, and basically its work is it's a domestic mission. In other words, we are the chief prosecutors for federal crimes in the United States or affecting interests of the United States. We don't have any appropriated funds to do international work per se. We have to instead link with the State Department, another executive branch agency, and come up with an interagency agreement to permit us to do international work. So at OPDAT, we dealt with some of our components, Assistant United States Attorneys. You heard someone also speak from CWAG yesterday, the Conference of Western Attorney Generals. We met with them and we said, we need to come up with a plan so the Department of Justice can extend its resources to our Mexican counterparts, and we can help to combat some of this drug violence that is raging out of control. So our interagency agreement has 4 major components. The first one was to strengthen extradition and mutual legal assistance. And what is meant by that is that our federal prosecutors have been frustrated, I guess is the word, by not being able to prosecute some of the members of Mexican drug cartels that are violating U.S. law, because we need to be able to communicate better with the courts, with the prosecutors, with law enforcement in Mexico about what we need as American prosecutors in order to bring a prosecution in this country and win it. So extradition and mutual legal assistance is at the top of our list on the interagency agreement with the State Department. Also, sort of happening at the same time was a change in the law in Mexico that requires within a certain period of time that the old inquisitorial style of prosecuting cases would transition to an oral adversarial style of prosecuting cases, which is more akin to how we prosecute cases in the United States. And the reason I say more akin is it certainly will not end up being the same. It will be Mexico's oral tradition. But as we transition to that, it will also make it easier for us to engage in extradition and mutual legal assistance as we learn more and more about this oral style of prosecuting cases. Chain of custody is also something that really did not exist in the Mexican criminal justice system, but it's something that's very, very important to American prosecutors who want to bring charges against the Mexican drug cartels. We need to be able to layer by layer present into court how we found evidence, what happened to the evidence after it was identified, how it was preserved, and here it is at trial. So we don't have in our system an investigating prosecutor that actually goes out to the scene. Our prosecutors do their very level best to never be a witness in their own case. So we need our law enforcement to understand the process of creating a chain of custody that will stand up at trial. Asset forfeiture and money laundering. I think there was a speaker yesterday who talked about kind of the counterpart to asset forfeiture in Mexico, which is abandonment. It's kind of a theory of abandonment. If there are assets of a drug cartel being used in the crime, or even if it's the proceeds of the crime, it can be seized by the government, and through a process either administrative or judicial, that property can be turned over to the government. And in the United States, that has been a very, very effective weapon dating back to the 80s. Again, when we were fighting the drug cartels from Colombia, we would take away their vehicles, we would take away their fast boats, we would take away their ranches and their horses and their other businesses, whatever we could prove was either the proceeds of illegal activity or facilitating property, in other words, property that was used in order to make the crime easier to commit. So asset forfeiture, and then finally, anti-corruption. And Mr. Robledo also mentioned that it's very difficult to get a handle on crime if you have people at your borders who are willing to look the other way for a price. So I want to echo what he said, and that is that the institutions must be above reproach. So with those pillars, I guess you could say, we went to the State Department and we said, these are the things that we have identified that would be helpful to U.S. law enforcement to prosecute here and helpful to Mexico to prosecute at home. So we do have an agreement in place. It has been in place now for 1 year. It's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar program of assistance that we call the Merida Initiative. Yes. Okay. I will try to do that. Yeah, I always, when I was trying cases in court, I could not survive if I didn't have a microphone. Nobody knew what I was saying. I'll try to keep my voice up. So the first thing that we did was we said we really need to have stronger ties with Mexico for extradition, because two things happen when you strengthen the ability to do mutual legal assistance and extradition. One thing we noticed in fighting the drug cartels in South Florida was that when you do have a good policy and a good relationship with a country for extradition and mutual legal assistance, the criminal elements who had been operating with impunity, all of a sudden now they realize there could be consequences for our actions. All of a sudden people are being arrested in the United States and they're being subjected to long sentences after they're convicted. So we are actually withdrawing criminals who otherwise would be available to commit further crimes in the home country or in the United States. Also, we were taking millions of dollars in assets, I mean, very expensive assets from the drug traffickers. We were also getting very adept at following the money and tracing assets through bank accounts. And as the criminals got more sophisticated, our law enforcement got more sophisticated, and our prosecutors in their complex cases got more sophisticated. So we were removing them from society, and we were also making them think. There's going to be a consequence here. We're going to have to get better lawyers. We're going to have to get more boats and more planes because we're being watched and people are coming after us now. The transition to an oral trial system. I'll tell you a little bit about how that worked out in real time in the Department of Justice, because I was very much involved in helping the United States Department of Justice respond to Mexico's efforts to transition to an oral trial system. Obviously, we have a very long tradition of oral trials. It doesn't matter what it says on the paper. What matters is what you can prove in court. The trial is the main thing in our system, and that's a concept that is not altogether comfortable for a Mexican prosecutor who's used to instead compiling the papers and submitting a dossier to a judge who would then siphon out what's evidence, what's not evidence, and decide on a conviction. So what we needed to do was to find a way to have prosecutors in Mexico perhaps go through the kind of training that American prosecutors go through when we're learning how to put on a trial for the very first time as new prosecutors. You heard someone talk about NITA yesterday. I think Judge Williams mentioned that she had gone through the NITA program for trial advocacy training. Well, at the Department of Justice, we have what we call the National Advocacy Center, and we all get sent there, and we're there for 2 weeks, and we learn how to be trial lawyers. So we came up with a program like that we could do with the PGR, who invited us to Mexico to run trial advocacy courses every month for a year, and we started this past February. Now, the trial advocacy training that we do is very much learning by doing. In other words, if you're going to do an opening statement, you have to sit down, you have to think about what is the story of the case, what is my theory for how I'm going to prove this, and all of this stuff is not something that you can have someone stand at a podium and teach you. You have to sit there and you have to grapple with the facts. So in order to train on things like direct examination, cross-examination, opening statements, hostile witnesses, we knew that Mexican prosecutors would learn in the same way that we learned, by trying to grapple with the facts. So when OPDAT was looking around for somebody to help with this matter, they said, you know what, we need people to go to Mexico and sit with the Mexican prosecutors who are experienced at trials, but also who share a language with the Mexican prosecutors, because it would be very difficult for them to sit and grapple with the facts and have to do that through interpreters. Now, there are approximately 10,000 prosecutors under the umbrella of the United States Department of Justice. And we didn't know how many of our prosecutors were fluent in Spanish, but we knew that we needed experienced prosecutors who speak fluent Spanish to participate in this trial advocacy program. Now, one of the things we do as prosecutors at the Department of Justice is, from time to time, we'll do a detail in another aspect of work. We don't always do the same job for our entire career. And I happen to take a detail for a short period of time in the Equal Employment Opportunity section of the office. In other words, people in the Department of Justice who had complaints because they felt they weren't being promoted, or they weren't being hired, or some such thing based upon their race or their gender or their physical disability, they could file complaints and they could go through an administrative process within the agency. Well, I did that for a while. So when they were looking for someone to deal with this question of who speaks Spanish in the Department of Justice, we were talking about an aspect of culture. So they're looking around and they say, okay, Michelle will do it. You'll find out of those 10,000 prosecutors who speak Spanish. So how do you do that? You know, you can't just send out to 10,000 people on email and say, anybody speak Spanish here? You know, we need some prosecutors. So what I did was I contacted the criminal chiefs, and I sent them email, and I said, we have the Merida initiative. It's a very important initiative from the White House to the Attorney General on down. This is something that is significant and would be a very important aspect of someone's career if they were to volunteer to work as a prosecutor and do this trial advocacy. So I got some responses that way. One guy called me up. He said, Ms. Crawford, my name is Brett Grayson. I want to volunteer to do trial advocacy under the Merida initiative. And I said to myself, now I very plainly said, this is a program where people will be grappling with the facts. We really need fluency in Spanish. So I said, oh, hello, Brett. How did you come by your fluency in Spanish? You have to be very delicate with these things in the United States. And Brett said, oh, you know what? I grew up in Venezuela. I'm an oil brat. And I said, okay, I'll sign you up. I got another call from a gentleman who said, oh, Michelle, I got an email from my criminal chief. I want to volunteer to do trial advocacy in the Merida initiative. And I said, okay. He said, my name is Sebastian Kilmanovich. And I was like, I thought I said I wanted Spanish speakers. So I said, well, Mr. Kilmanovich, thank you for volunteering. How is it that you've acquired Spanish fluency? He said, I'm an Argentinian American. I've been speaking Spanish all my life. And I said, okay, I'm signing you up. And so we started out with a list of approximately 24 prosecutors, and we now have a list of about 80. I know there are others. I think there are approximately 150 fluent Spanish speakers among the 10,000 prosecutors, but not everybody will volunteer. Some people feel maybe it's too violent, or maybe they're not confident enough in their trial abilities, or for whatever reason. But we have approximately 80 prosecutors now who are participating in the trial advocacy program in Mexico. Now, the head of that program is our resident legal advisor. His name is Kevin Sunwall. So if you go to Mexico to work on rule of law issues, please say hello to Kevin Sunwall. He has a very exciting job in Mexico bringing DOJ resources to bear on the problem. Now, there's a couple of other areas, code reform and also gangs, where the Department of Justice has been requested by Mexico to help out. We obviously have a lot of experience with gangs in the United States. We don't have all the answers, but we certainly are faced with a lot of problems. And code reform, in order to really be able to rely on all aspects of the criminal justice system, you have to have an underlying procedural code which allows you to do the things that you need to do. So those are some of the ways that the Department of Justice is answering this very urgent and very heartbreaking call for assistance on criminal justice sector reform in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Gracias a usted, Michelle. Matthew Robinson is a professor in the Department of Government and Justice Studies at the Appalachian State University. He earned his PhD in criminology and criminal justice at the Florida State University in 1997. Robinson teaches and does research in the areas of criminological theory, the drug war, capital punishment, and injustices of the criminal justice system. He has published more than 10 books, including Lies, Damned Lies, and Drug War Statistics, a critical analysis of claims made by the Office of National Drug Control Policy, State University of New York Press. Dead Nation, the experts explain American capital punishment, and media coverage of crime and criminal justice. He has also published articles on American drug control policy, including research on the gateway hypothesis, as well as numerous critical analyses of the Office of National Drug Control Policy's National Drug Control Strategy. Robinson also served on the board of directors for the Southern Criminal Justice Association and was the organization president in 2003-2004. He is now president of the North Carolina Criminal Justice Association.
Good morning, thank you. First, I would like to thank Alex for the fine job he did organizing this conference, as well as the others that were involved. Professor Paul Zwier for his hospitality and being involved in the organization as well. The Emory Law School, USAID, and everyone else that was involved in this conference. It's really an honor to be here with you. It's an honor to meet a lot of you and to be making new friendships as well, both in the United States as well as Mexico. My presentation today is based on my research on this office called the Office of National Drug Control Policy. This is the lead federal agency in the United States that organizes and orchestrates our national drug control policy. So you may know them as the Drug Czar's office. It's a term that's been applied to them in the past. This office every year is charged by Congress to state the goals of national drug control policy, to state the goals of what we in the United States have long called the drug war. They're also required to state the budget, to determine which agencies get how much money, and to communicate with the American people how it's going, how drug policy is effective or not. We have analyzed, my co-author and I, Renee Sherlin from Appalachian State, we have analyzed the 2000 through the 2007 National Drug Control Strategies. And I've done subsequent analysis of the 2008, 2009, and 2010 strategies. So this document, the National Drug Control Strategy, is the primary way that the United States government communicates with the American people and with Congress about how the drug war is going. Well, you might guess, based on the title of the book, Lies, Damn Lies, and Drug War Statistics, that my argument is that the United States government manipulates data to suggest that national drug control policy is going well, when in fact it's not going well at all. So my presentation is about two major things. The first is whether we are meeting our stated goals as a country in terms of drug policy, and the second is how does ONDCP, I'll call it the office for simplicity, the Office of National Drug Control Policy. What does it say about these goals? How does it utilize data? These are historically the goals of national drug control policy, the first being the most important, to reduce drug use in the United States. We also want to reduce supply of drugs, help people that have drug abuse problems through treatment. And these final two were actually dropped by the Bush administration, by ONDCP under the Bush administration, reducing crime and reducing health and social costs. However, the Obama administration has taken the final one, number 5, and reinitiated it or reprioritized it, basically saying that the two goals now are to reduce drug use and to reduce consequences of drug use, including death. So for example, here's a slide from 2010, from the most recent National Drug Control Strategy. They're saying, if you look at this red line here, there's a lot more people dying from drugs. In fact, it's the only major cause of death on this slide that's increasing. What's interesting is ONDCP is still silent about what this means. This, to me, is the clearest indicator of failure of policy, that over time, more Americans are dying from drugs. Even as we spend more money, we sacrifice more lives, we break up more families, as well as many other things, spend more money. If you look at the death rate per user, which is very interesting, drugs are actually 5 times more likely to kill you now than they were in 1979 for the average user. This is because illegal drugs are becoming more dangerous and people are switching to more dangerous drugs. This is one of the ultimate results of drug prohibition. So here's my major conclusions, and then I'll show you some examples of the research. The first conclusion of this research is that the actual data available from the Office of National Drug Control Policy show that none of their stated goals are being met. Drug use is not down since the office was founded. Young people have not stopped using drugs. They've simply switched, and often to more dangerous drugs. Drugs are still widely available to Americans. They're no less available. And the vast majority of people who need drug treatment simply don't get it in the United States. The second conclusion is that the ONDCP denies this, basically. And they do this for several ways, so I'll show you examples of this. They focus on short-term drug use trends to claim success while ignoring long-term trends. They overemphasize the data source called Monitoring the Future, which is a measure of young people's drug use, and they focus on certain drugs while ignoring others. They sell policies that evidence suggests are failing, such as student drug testing, in spite of the actual published evidence of their ineffectiveness. They selectively present data and actually manipulate data. I'll show you one clear example of that today to make their case. They fail to provide a real comprehensive assessment on market disruption efforts like price, availability, and purity of illegal drugs. And they fail to do any kind of cost-benefits analysis. So they always talk about the benefits of drug policy while ignoring the costs in order to see which weighs more. So here are some examples of these findings. The first and, of course, most important question is drug use down? This is an example of the kind of presentation that the office makes. So you see, look here, right? They're saying, look here, drug use is down. This is drug use by 8th, 10th, and 12th graders from 1991 on. So we're winning, right? Except that drug use is actually higher now than it was when the office was founded. So as a taxpayer and as a citizen of the United States, I want to know, why is drug use higher now than it was before we founded an office to actually fight the drug war? It's a fair question. Here's another example of the type of presentation. Notice the short-term focus. This table shows you that drug use is down across the board, apparently. All of these negative numbers means that drug use is down by that percentage. The stars mean it's statistically significant, so that means this is based on a sample of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. Okay, so this is not random error. What's interesting about this slide is you look, every single type of drug use is down except heroin, apparently. But so is alcohol and tobacco use, which is illegal for young people, but we don't have a war on it. So the question is, why is alcohol and tobacco down, even though we're not fighting a war? Maybe that's the main reason why these other forms of drug use are down as well. But you notice this, if you can read, I'm not sure how well all of you read English, but in terms of, you probably recognize the drug names, right? But you don't see narcotics. You don't see data on sedatives. You don't see data on tranquilizers. Well, why is that? You might suspect, and you would be correct, that that's because these drugs are actually increasing in terms of use. So ONDCP simply ignores the data. Now, in fairness to President Obama and the new drug czar, Gil Kurlikowski, there is a renewed emphasis on prescription drug abuse, finally. So this is the 2010 strategy. The box says that after marijuana, 7 of the most prevalent types of drug use are prescription drugs. So here's your evidence that young people are switching to drugs that are easier to find. Unfortunately, these drugs are more addictive and they're more deadly than the drugs that they used to use, the ones we're fighting the war on. Here's an example from the 2010 strategy of ONDCP's focus. To the credit of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, I'm very pleased that finally ONDCP has gone back to 1975 to show us what's happening long term. But ONDCP, whoops, sorry about that. It's a sensitive computer, forgive me. The red line indicates when the Office of National Drug Control Policy was founded, November of 1988. As you can see, drug use is not down among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders from that time, which is their stated goal. Now, they've made it clear, not only do they want to reduce drug use, they want to reduce it consistently. So the trend line should look like this. But that's not what it looks like. Now, another way that, and this is what I would like to see the office do every year, is a systematic evaluation of drug policy, drug by drug, population by population. So I'm going to show you real quickly what's really happening with drug use in terms of 12th graders, which is the most common use of age of use, 18 to 25-year-olds. So this is cocaine. Cocaine use is not down. You keep a record of this. Cocaine use, not down. Ecstasy use, not down. Methamphetamine use, declining. LSD, declining. So that's the good news, okay? Marijuana use, increasing. Narcotics use, increasing. Sedatives use, increasing. Tranquilizer use, increasing. We have a losing record. If we were a sports team, we would be demoted to a lower level, right? Or we'd be, we'd have to fold our tents and try another sport. And again, the point of this is that young people are simply switching drugs. They're moving away from drugs like ecstasy and LSD, which are not addictive, which are not deadly in the sense of overdose death, and they're switching to drugs like tranquilizers, sedatives, narcotics, which are addictive and can kill you from an overdose, much more likely to kill you. And then all this talk about young people, what about adults? I should point out both President Bush and President Clinton before him, and now President Obama, have stated they have goals to reduce drug use among adults as well. The Bush administration simply ignored the data on adults and focused on young people. This is a slide from the 2010 strategy. In orange at the top is young adults, 18 to 25, and on the bottom in red is adults, 26 and older. And you see that drug use among adults is not down. It's not increasing very rapidly, but it's not down, which is the stated goal. Keep in mind that this is during a time when U.S. taxpayers are paying more and more every year to fight the drug war. This shows you in billions of U.S. dollars. Interestingly, this is the official budget of ONDCP, the office. It's a vast understatement of how much we actually spend. For example, in 2003, the Office of National Drug Control Policy changed their budget, the way that they do the budget. They just decided to remove every dollar we spend on federal law enforcement, every dollar we spend in federal courts, and every dollar we spend on federal corrections from the budget. We're still spending it, it's just not in the budget. That has two effects. One, it reduces the size of the budget, and two, it makes it look like we're spending a higher portion of the budget on treatment and prevention, when in fact we're not. It's creative accounting, if you will. The office actually said, this makes the budget more accountable to the American people. That's what they said. That's what they said in writing. Now here's the clearest example of manipulation of data. This is a slide showing drug use in gray, marijuana use, and black, cocaine use. And this is, I don't know how many of you are familiar, particularly from Mexico, with Nancy Reagan's campaign, Just Say No to Drugs, the First Lady. So they're saying right here, look right here, that when Nancy Reagan told the American people to just say no, and notice they're focusing on 18 to 25-year-olds for some reason as opposed to children. But when Nancy Reagan said just say no, cocaine use started going down. See that? Cocaine use had gone up, and thank goodness for Nancy Reagan, because cocaine use actually went down as a result. Now, never mind the fact that every single published study that's ever been done shows that this program was ineffective. Forget all that. What's interesting is in 2006, you see the same slide from the strategy right there. But note it, and notice it's still 18 and 25-year-olds. Look at the trend line now. Different trend line, right? If you don't get it, let me show you what I mean. Just compare the two trends. The first one's from 2003, the second one's from 2006. See the difference? Well, the bottom one is the accurate one. Okay, the bottom slide is the accurate slide. The top one is not, it's a mistake, if you will. So then what about this claim that Nancy Reagan made drug use go down? This is false, this is wrong, this is a lie. It simply did not happen. And ONDCP has never issued a retraction on this slide. So busted. Now I asked the chief policy analyst, the top scientist from the White House, who's involved in creating these documents. I showed him this slide and he said, I didn't make it. He said, we didn't make it. We hired someone to make that slide, which I guess makes it okay. All right, the second goal is, are drugs less available? Here you'll see that ONDCP states a theory, a testable theory. Basically it says this: if you disrupt supplies, prices go up, drug supplies become erratic, and use goes down. The beauty of this is it's measurable. 2010, if you take drugs out of circulation, prices rise, drug use goes down. All of this is measurable, and we have data on them, right? Well, rather than presenting data systematically, ONDCP does this. They say, look, from 2001 to 2004, we've made ecstasy less available, and therefore use has gone down. And see, we've made LSD less available, and therefore use has gone down. So I was curious if this was true. I went and made my own slide on drug availability in the United States. This is from monitoring the featured data, the same data that ONDCP uses. Those slides focus here on 2000 to 2004. They focus on ecstasy and LSD only. If you can't see those, there they are. Why would ONDCP choose these two drugs to focus on? Because from 2000 to 2004, they're the only drugs that were availability went down. This is called cherry picking. Does that translate well? Cherry picking? You pick favorable data and ignore the rest? In terms of prices and purity, look, during 2007, cocaine prices went up and purity went down. The stated goal of the policy. Okay? This is from 2010. From 2007 to 2009, price of cocaine went up and purity went down. So it's working, right? Our strategy's working. Well, I went to the White House, okay? These are there. You notice the source on the bottom. These are White House data. These are prices of cocaine. Down. Crack, down. Heroin, down. Methamphetamine, down. Marijuana, down. Cocaine, now purity, unchanged. Crack cocaine, slightly down. Heroin, up. Methamphetamine, up. Marijuana, up. Marijuana, up. Okay, so basically, drugs are generally cheaper and better now than they were when the office was founded. These are according to their data from their website. Here's another quick example. Cocaine production in Colombia, up or down? They say it's down. It's actually up. I say that a blind squirrel, a blind monkey could see this. Flights coming out of Colombia are down while they go up in Venezuela. They claim success. It's basically displacement. I'm running out of time real quickly. Is treatment more available? This one's easy. No. In light blue is the number of people who do not receive treatment that need it. The vast majority of drug users do not need it. ONDCP historically has claimed this is because people are in denial. They don't know they need help. In fact, that may be true, but you also see in blue that as a proportion of our budget, we're spending less and less on prevention and treatment every year, and more on the war part of the war, law enforcement, military, and international spending. To President Obama's credit, there's been a 1 percentage point change back in favor of treatment and prevention. So President Obama was elected on the mantle of change we can believe in, 1 percentage point at a time. It's better than nothing. So in conclusion, 2 conclusions. The first is that national drug control policy in the United States is a massive failure, as Judge Gray argued yesterday. The second one is that the national drug control strategy is not useful for policy evaluation, since it's such, who've reviewed the strategy and our approach and found them to be failing. And these, my last point, these are the results scores out of 100 for various agencies involved and programs involved in drug policy. What do you see? Every single one of them receives a failing score by the United States government in terms of their effectiveness. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions when we're done.
Muy ilustrativo el cuestionamiento que el doctor Robinson hace al manejo oficial de las estadísticas, invita a la reflexión. Y ahora, para ofrecernos también una perspectiva académica, contamos con el doctor Howard Campbell. He is a professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Texas, El Paso. He is the author or editor of 6 volumes about Mexico, including a book from University of Texas Press called Drug War Zone, Frontline Dispatches from the Streets of El Paso and Juarez. Additionally, he is the author of a bilingual children's book titled A Dog Named Pavlov, Un Perro Llamado Pavlov. Dr. Campbell received his PhD and 2 master's degrees from the University of Wisconsin. He also received a BA from the University of Idaho. Dr. Campbell is a specialist in Latin American studies with a primary focus on Mexico. He has conducted ethnographic field work among the Zapotec people of Oaxaca, Mexico, at various times since 1982. Dr. Campbell has also conducted extensive research with the Piro Manso Tiwa Indian tribe of Las Cruces, New Mexico. His academic expertise is concerned primarily with ethnicity, political anthropology, social and intellectual movements, U.S.-Mexico border culture, and drug trafficking. Dr. Campbell has been professor at UTEP since 1991. Su tema es narcopropaganda en la guerra mexicana contra las drogas. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. I'm a bit of an absent-minded professor. In fact, I went to the Emory Law School this morning. I thought the conference was going to be there, and so I had to rush back here. Also, I'm not very good at running through these PowerPoint presentations, so I'm going to ask for my friend Matt to help me switch the slides here. But thank you very much for the kind invitation. I especially want to thank Alex for inviting me to this conference. I'm hoping that my presentation will complement that of Professor Robledo, and also Matt's presentation, which is obviously about U.S. propaganda vis-a-vis drug issues, and I'll be talking about, to some extent, the flip side of that, which is a kind of propaganda coming out of Mexico. So my presentation is called Narco-propaganda and the Mexican Drug War. My research is focused especially in Ciudad Juarez, where I'm not sure if you know how bad things have gotten in Juarez. This year alone, 109 policemen have been murdered in Juarez. More than 6,600 people have died in drug-related violence in Juarez since January 2008. And so far this year, more than 2,200 people have been murdered in Juarez. So what I'll be talking about is thinking very much in terms of the situation in Juarez. And as you well know, that organized crime groups have become a serious threat to the Mexican state and civil society, even though the boundaries are blurred between cartels and the police and military. Now, my field, anthropology, tends to study crime issues in terms of deconstructing, criminalizing discourses of the state, which I think is a well-founded approach. But I think we also need to deconstruct discourses generated by organized crime groups who have a kind of relative autonomy from the state. So I'm thinking here especially of the Cartel de Juarez and their allies, Los Aztecas, but also the Chapo Guzman cartel that operates in Juarez. I argue that Mexican organized crime groups, and I put cartels in quotes because oftentimes there's a great deal of ambiguity about who are the members of these crime groups, but that they produce a quasi-political discourse, a form of narco-propaganda, but this narco-propaganda is not a fully formed political ideology, but nonetheless I think it's become a very important part of public discourse in Mexico. It can't be ignored, even though the data is mysterious and very ambiguous. It's very hard to know exactly who are the authors of this propaganda. There's a kind of mysteriousness to it, and that mysteriousness gives it even more power. But in general, this narco-propaganda is a discourse directed at rival cartels, but also the general public and the Mexican government. It's a form of psychological warfare or terrorism, I would argue, and it's designed to intimidate, dehumanize, and dominate. The main forms of narco-propaganda, in my opinion, are, and I actually had hoped to have pictures of some of this, but as I said, I'm not very good at constructing PowerPoint presentations, and I don't think you'd want to see a lot of the images of this, but we're talking about acts of symbolic, orchestrated violence for public view, dozens of bodies piled up in the street in various ways, narco messages, which are written statements and signs, acts of violence and torture. So I would argue that these forms of violence communicate meaning and ideas, but also we're in the cyber world now, so you'll have videos of these killings and torture and so on, and cyber postings. I'll get into all of these forms of violence in a moment, but there's also a genre of narco music and lyrics, and we can also talk about how organized crime groups control and or censor mass media, and my knowledge of this is from talking to Mexican journalists, especially in Juarez and in Torreon and Saltillo and various other places, Tamaulipas. But the types of narco-violence I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but you're talking about decapitations, people being beheaded individually or in many cases as much as 10 or even 25 people, their heads cut off, and then videos taken of these beheadings and posted on YouTube videos. There's a very remarkable website called El Blog del Narco, in which you can look at and watch YouTube videos of people being interrogated and then tortured, and in some cases their heads cut off, and you can see the blood and the person dying in this video by people that are associated with organized crime. Many times the murders in Juarez related to drug trafficking are timed to be on television news. So the killing occurs at 4 o'clock in order to make the 5:30 news, or it occurs at 8 o'clock in order to make the 9:30 news, especially on Channel 44. In many cases you have desecration of bodies, and I think one of our speakers later today in the panel, Rocio, can talk about the importance of bodies and violence. But it's just incredible violence involving maiming, torture, chopping off of limbs, organs, etc. And all of these kinds of desecration of bodies have symbolic meanings. Cutting off a finger meaning that the person that was killed was a snitch, cutting off the tongue, that they were an informant, cutting off the hands, that they stole money or loads of drugs. In addition to this kind of violence, you have rape and sexual torture, and in fact, some of the killings of women in Juarez that are often referred to as femicides, I think we can link to drug trafficking organizations or other organized crime groups. Aspects of this violence include, as I mentioned earlier, ritualized presentations or spectacles of the displacement or placement of bodies, and a whole language has arisen to describe these types of presentation of bodies, including the entapados, which is people that are killed and then their body is taped up with duct tape all over the face and perhaps other parts of the body. And cajuelados are people that are murdered and put in the trunk of cars. It goes on, and it's very gruesome. Entambados, people that are killed and put in 55-gallon drums. And cobijados, people that are wrapped in sheets. In Juarez, we've seen in other parts of Mexico bodies hung from bridges and buildings. Recently in Chihuahua, there's been a rash of people that were murdered and then crucified, their bodies hung on barbed wire fences. And we've seen cases of displays of severed heads and multiple bodies piled up. In other cases, bodies are written on, and insults and slogans are written on the bodies. And in other cases, the bodies are deformed or decorated, including in Juarez especially, killing someone and putting a pig mask over their face. Sometimes the pants are pulled down to emasculate the person, or a knife stuck in the face. And in one case, I believe this was in Sinaloa or Durango, there was a person who was killed and then their face was stitched to a soccer ball. So the degree of the cruelty involved is extreme. An important aspect of narco-propaganda are the narco messages, narco mensajes, especially what are called narco-mantas, which are signs, banners, or manifestos. I tried to give you an example of this. As you can see, it's sort of a scrawl, but it contains insults and threats, denunciations, attacks on politicians and drug lords. And I would argue that these are political statements, not just criminal acts, that they involve political positioning. But you notice how much text there is there. These are important political messages. Also, a very common form is what are called narco-pintas, which is graffiti on walls. And here's one that says, pinche chapo de mierda, blah, 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 blah. Atentamente Diego. So these narco-pintas often have a signature. And what I find interesting about these, and I've seen hundreds of these in Juarez, is that they're very reminiscent of the left-wing protest propaganda you would see in Mexico in the 70s and 80s done by left-wing radicals, except the left-wing radicals could spell words correctly and they had good grammar. One of the trademarks of the narco-pintas is extremely bad grammar and misspelled words and very, very vulgar threats and so on and so forth. But it's all about who controls the drug plaza. The narco blogs are an especially interesting phenomenon which involve, again, it's very ambiguous. You can't always tell who's who on these blogs, but there's enough of it, I mean literally thousands of posts and many different blogs, that clearly there are some cartel members involved. It was rumored that Chapo Guzman's son, Edgar Guzman, was one of the sort of intellectuals of the Chapo Guzman cartel, and he worked a lot in the cyber world with blogs and so on. But these blogs involve insults, but also information about who killed whom, and often a kind of macho posturing about who's, more badass than anybody else. But I would really encourage you, if you haven't seen El Blog del Narco, you can see what the images of this drug war look like and what the narco-propaganda consists of in terms of videos, photos, and reports. You can look on YouTube. There's an especially interesting YouTube video called El Quitapuercos de Chihuahua, which is about the attempt by the Chapo Guzman cartel to take over the plaza of Juarez. And so they posted dozens of photographs of members of the Juarez cartel and argued that these people would be wiped out by Chapo Guzman, and in many cases they were. Lists of policemen that would be murdered, and in fact those policemen were murdered. I think I skipped a little bit here, but let's see if I can screw up this PowerPoint presentation. But also, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the narco-corridos, the norteño musical genre that often celebrates drug lords and cartels and their exploits. And some of these bands are, in fact, house bands for narcos. That is, the particular narco-corrido group is basically associated with one cartel and is loyal to that cartel. Consequently, There have been murders of dozens of musicians by cartel members, including Chalino Sanchez, who was basically the founder of the narco-corrido genre, Valentin Elizalde, and many others. But in addition to murders of musicians, you have murders and intimidation of journalists, especially in the Laguna area. I've talked to journalists there who say that cartel members have actually come into newspaper offices and told the editors and reporters what they can publish and what they cannot. They lay down la línea of what's possible to publish in Mexican newspapers. You may have heard that El Diario de Juárez recently wrote an editorial in which they interrogated the Mexican government and also the narcos, and they basically raised the question, look, you, the cartels, are in control of Juárez, and what do you want us to do? Because recently a photographer associated with El Diario was murdered. I would argue that collectively all of these forms of violence, control, and domination of information, YouTube videos, cyber blogs, etc., form a kind of narco-terror and control of information that in fact form a primitive discourse. And that's what I'm talking about when I say narco-propaganda. The basic message of this narco-propaganda, and to put it very bluntly and crudely, is that we, the members of X cartel, and again, when we say cartel, it's sort of ambiguous because we're talking about organized crime elements as well as their police and military and government allies, but that we are the legitimate owners of the plaza and we will exterminate anyone who gets in our way. So I see this as a kind of nihilistic, fascistic rhetoric. It's one similar to the rhetoric generated by the Colombian paras, and it's all about control of territory and the profits of the drug trade as well as other crimes. It's not, as Professor Robledo said, designed to take over Mexico as a nation. Obviously, Mexico is not a failed state, but certain regions of the country in some ways are controlled by organized crime. I think you could argue that in some ways Ciudad Juárez is a failed state or a failed city in some sense, failed state with a small s. Maybe you could even say that about the state of Chihuahua. But anyway, my point here is that I feel that this narco-propaganda is a kind of unorthodox politics, but a kind of politics with very serious consequences for the future of Mexican state and society. I wanted to close, and if I can do this on this PowerPoint, with a narco-corrido, just to give you a flavor for what this discourse is like. And I welcome any questions or comments. This is a work in progress. If you have any criticisms, I'd love to hear them. And maybe Matt could rescue me here by clicking on this thing. It's not connected. Well, for those of you from Baja California, I wanted to play a song called El Teo by Los Tucanes de Tijuana, which has a wonderful sound, but it's all about celebrating a drug trafficking leader named El Teo. So anyway, thank you very much.